The room is still. The light is low or absent entirely, and somewhere in the quiet you find yourself already in a conversation that has not yet happened. You are watching a version of tomorrow unfold, testing its possibilities, preparing for outcomes that may never arrive in any recognizable form. The future, which does not yet exist, takes on a strange kind of weight in these hours. It settles over you, with something approaching presence. This is what we will sit with tonight. Not to fix it, not to explain it away, but to understand it more deeply, to follow it gently into its own nature and see what it reveals about the human mind, about consciousness, about the particular and curious relationship between a person and their sense of what might come. Several philosophers and thinkers have spent considerable time with this very question, approaching it from different directions, and their ideas will move through this reflection as the hours do, quietly, without urgency. They are not being summoned here to provide answers. They are being invited because each one noticed something true about what we are doing when we lie awake and imagine the future. And their noticing is worth sharing in the quiet. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher whose work transformed the way the 20th century thought about human existence, saw projection into the future not as a habit or a flaw, but as something fundamental to what it means to be human at all. For Heidegger, a human being is not simply a creature that exists in the present. It is, at its core, a being that throws itself forward into possibility. To be human, in his understanding, is to always be reaching ahead, to always be already living, in some sense, in what has not yet arrived. The mind that moves into tomorrow's conversation is not deviating from its proper function. It is expressing the deepest structure of what it means to be conscious at all. The Stoic philosophers, those practical thinkers of ancient Greece and Rome, were deeply interested in the relationship between what we imagine and what we suffer. They noticed, with considerable precision, that most human pain is not caused by events themselves, but by mental rehearsals of events. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, described the mind's tendency to multiply its suffering through anticipation with a directness that feels entirely contemporary. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Epictetus, who had been born into slavery and found in philosophy not an academic discipline, but a genuine practice of freedom, taught that the boundary between what is within our control and what lies beyond it is the most important distinction a thinking person can draw. The future, with its infinite possible variations, lies almost entirely beyond it. Sigmund Freud, approaching the question from the territory of psychology rather than philosophy, saw anticipatory thinking as a kind of mental preparation, a way the psyche attempts to manage anxiety by rehearsing what it fears. He called one form of this signal anxiety, the mind generating a controlled, small-scale version of anticipated difficulty in order to prepare itself before the difficulty arrives in full. Carl Jung, who began as Freud's student and later developed a significantly different understanding of the psyche, was interested in something adjacent but distinct. The way the unconscious mind uses imagined futures not only to manage anxiety, but to explore possible selves, to audition identities, to try on versions of a life that the waking mind has not yet committed to. The person who keeps imagining themselves in a different city, a different relationship, a different vocation, is not simply escaping. They are doing something the psyche requires, exploring the range of what is possible. Buddhism offers yet another angle, and in some ways the most precise one, for the specific experience of lying awake at night. The Buddhist tradition is particularly careful about what it calls the grasping mind, the quality of consciousness that reaches for outcomes, clings to preferred possibilities, and generates suffering not from what is real, but from the distance between what is imagined and what is. The Pali word tanha, often translated as craving or thirst, describes this restless reaching quality in consciousness, and it sits at the heart of the Buddhist understanding of why the mind suffers even when the body is safe. The imagined future conversation that will not settle, that keeps returning in new variations, that demands resolution before sleep is allowed to come, is the grasping mind in one of its most recognizable forms. Taoist philosophy brings something quieter still. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to the sage Laozi, and composed somewhere in the early centuries of Chinese thought, returns again and again to the idea of wu wei, often translated as non-doing, or effortless action, or simply not forcing. There is something in Taoist thought that gently questions the very premise of mental forcing, of trying to control or pre-live what has not yet arrived. The water does not try to find the sea. It simply flows in the direction that the ground allows. The mind that is always trying to determine how things will go is, in the Taoist understanding, working against something rather than with it. And through all of this, running as an undercurrent, is existentialist thought. The tradition associated most immediately with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir in the 20th century, but which draws on a much longer lineage, including Kierkegaard in the 19th century, and stretching through Heidegger himself. Existentialism is, among other things, a sustained meditation on what it means to be free in a universe that offers no guarantees, where the future is genuinely open, genuinely undetermined, and where that openness is experienced not as liberation, but as a particular weight. The anxiety that attaches to imagined future scenarios is not, in the existentialist understanding, a malfunction. It is the signature of genuine freedom. It is what freedom feels like from the inside when it is not yet understood or accepted. These ideas will not be presented as a course or a curriculum tonight. They will arise the way thoughts arise on a quiet night, following their own logic, sometimes doubling back, sometimes pausing to let something settle before moving forward. The goal is not to arrive at conclusions. The goal is to sit with these questions long enough that they begin to illuminate something about why the mind does what it does in the hours when the world goes still, something about the particular human relationship with time and uncertainty and imagined possibility, something that, perhaps, makes the experience of lying awake and thinking feel less like a problem and more like what it actually is, one of the most distinctively human things there is. So let the body settle into whatever position it has found. Let the breath find its own rhythm. The mind may continue doing what it does. That, too, is part of what we are here to understand. Before any of the ideas, before the philosophy arrives to offer its perspective, there is just the experience itself. A person lying in a room, a mind that will not quite rest, a quality of darkness that is familiar enough to be almost comforting, and a quality of quiet that, paradoxically, makes the inner activity louder rather than softer. There is no distraction here. The things that ordinarily occupy the foreground of attention, the tasks, the interactions, the movement through a day, have all receded. And in their absence, the mind finds itself alone with its own contents, with the material it has been accumulating and processing and, sometimes, actively avoiding throughout the hours of the day. The night is, in this sense, a kind of return. The mind returns to what has been deferred. It returns to the questions that could not be attended to properly in the midst of the day's demands. It returns to the relationships that carry more weight than the daylight hours provided space to examine. It returns, above all, to the future, to the territory of what has not yet been resolved, what has not yet been decided, what has not yet arrived to be navigated. This is one of the reasons the night can feel so much heavier than the day, even when the objective circumstances of both are identical. In the day, the weight is distributed across tasks and conversations, and the perpetual forward motion of a life in action. At night, it gathers. The weight that was spread thin across many hours concentrates itself into the quiet, and makes itself felt as though, for the first time. Understanding this does not lift the weight immediately, but it changes the relationship to it. The mind that understands why it is doing what it is doing has a slightly different relationship to the doing. It is not simply caught in the activity. It is also, in some small part, observing it, and the observation, even when it changes nothing right away, introduces a degree of perspective that pure immersion cannot provide. This is what philosophy, at its most useful, offers. Not solutions to the things that keep the mind awake, but perspective. The capacity to step back from an experience far enough to see its shape, its logic, its place in the larger territory of what it means to be a thinking, feeling, anticipating human being. Begin with the simplest observation. Before the philosophy, before the analysis, just the plain fact of it. You are lying still, and your mind is elsewhere. Not in memory, not drifting in pure sensation, but somewhere ahead of you in time, inhabiting a scene that has not yet occurred, watching yourself move through a conversation, or a meeting, or an arrival, or a confrontation, or a silence. The body is at rest. The mind is at work. And the work it is doing feels, in some strange way, urgent, as though by rehearsing this scene one more time, by adjusting the words again, by imagining the other person's expression more carefully, something will be prepared, something will be made safer, something will be resolved. This is one of the most familiar forms of human experience, and one of the least examined. We accept it as given, as the way things are, without pausing to ask what it actually reveals about the structure of conscious life. Why should the mind move forward rather than backward? Why should it construct simulations of the future rather than rest in the present? Why, in the quietest and most unconstrained hours of the day, does it choose anticipation over stillness? Heidegger called this quality of human existence Entwurf, usually translated as projection. His understanding was precise, and once you sit with it for a while, quite remarkable. He argued that human beings do not simply live in the present the way a stone sits on the ground, or the way water fills a vessel. A stone is just there. It does not project itself into next week. Water does not rehearse how it will fill tomorrow's glass. But a human being exists, in Heidegger's language, as possibility. We are always, in some sense, ahead of ourselves. The German word he used for human existence was Dasein, which translates simply as being there. But his point was that this being there is never just here, never just now. Dasein is always thrown forward, always anticipating, always already living into the next moment, the next situation, the possible outcomes of the decisions it is navigating. We do not have the option of existing only in the present moment in the way a non-conscious thing exists. Our very consciousness is structured by temporal extension. The past shapes us. The future draws us forward. To be human, in this understanding, is to be perpetually in draft form. You may want to sit with that idea for a moment, not as a problem to be solved, more as a recognition of something you may have always sensed, but never quite had language for. You are not malfunctioning when your mind races ahead into tomorrow. You are doing something that, according to Heidegger, is built into the very structure of human consciousness. The animal resting in the field is fully present, its awareness bounded by the immediate environment, the smell of the grass, the warmth of the sun. The human resting in the bed is already in next Tuesday's meeting, already in the conversation that will happen on the phone tomorrow morning, already in the apartment of a decision that hasn't been made yet. This is not a failure of mindfulness. This is the shape of a mind. Consider a person lying awake on a Sunday night. The week ahead has a particular texture, a presentation to give to people whose reactions matter, a conversation that has been deferred too long and has accumulated complexity in the deferral, a decision that keeps refusing to resolve itself into clarity. She is not anxious exactly. She is not in obvious distress. She is simply rehearsing, running the week forward in her mind, testing each moment for its likely resistance, feeling where the friction might gather, preparing herself for what she imagines the friction will feel like. This quality of mental rehearsal is not irrational. In fact, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, the capacity for mental simulation is one of the great cognitive advantages our species possesses. The ability to imagine events before they occur, to test responses in the mind before committing the body to them, to learn from imagined failure before experiencing real failure. This is part of what has made human life so extraordinarily adaptive, so creative, so capable of operating in genuinely novel circumstances without precedent. A deer startled in the forest responds with the behaviors its nervous system has prepared over thousands of generations. A human being encountering a new kind of challenge can reason through it, model it, test possible responses against imagined versions of it, and arrive at a response that has never existed before. This is remarkable. The nighttime mind, running its scenarios, is part of this same remarkable capacity. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, writing about consciousness from a tradition quite different from Heidegger's, described the human brain as fundamentally an anticipation machine. Its primary business, in this account, is not to respond to what is happening, but to predict what is about to happen. Every perception is already shaped by expectation. Every moment of experience is preceded by a model of what that moment is likely to contain. And perception is largely the process of confirming, adjusting, or correcting that model against incoming data. Consciousness, in this view, is less a window on the present than a running simulation of possible presents, constantly updated, constantly revised. Freud, approaching the same phenomenon from the direction of psychoanalysis, described what he called signal anxiety. His thinking was as follows: the most primitive and overwhelming form of anxiety is the experience of being flooded by a threat one cannot process. The infant left alone, the person caught in genuine danger, the psyche confronted with something for which it has no adequate response. This kind of anxiety is the psyche overwhelmed. But signal anxiety is different. Signal anxiety is anticipatory, managed, controlled. It is the mind generating a small, calibrated version of anticipated difficulty in order to prepare a response before the difficulty arrives. The rehearsal of tomorrow's difficult meeting is, in this sense, the psyche being protective. It is trying to prevent itself from being overwhelmed by ensuring that no aspect of the experience arrives as a complete surprise. There is something almost tender in this understanding. The mind that will not let you rest, that keeps running the same conversations and scenarios through the quiet hours, is not tormenting you. It is trying, in the way it knows, to take care of you. It is preparing you. It is doing what it has always done, the thing that made human survival possible, anticipating difficulty before it arrives, so that when it arrives, it is not entirely novel. And yet, the preparation, as we will explore, is not always effective in the way it intends to be. The scenarios that are rehearsed most intensively are often the ones that arrive, when they arrive, in forms that bear only partial resemblance to the rehearsed version. The mind has prepared for one conversation, and a different one occurs. The preparation has addressed possible responses to imagined reactions, and the actual reactions were ones the imagination did not supply. This gap between the imagined and the actual is not a failure of imagination. It is simply the nature of other people, of real events, of the irreducible unpredictability of the world as it actually unfolds. At night, when the other inputs have quieted, when there is no task immediately demanding attention, this anticipatory function does not simply turn off. It continues, and in some cases it amplifies, because the competition from other stimuli has been removed. In the daytime, the mind is occupied with the actual. There are things to do, people to respond to, immediate demands that draw the attention into the present. At night, the present becomes sparse. The weight of the blanket, the quality of the darkness, the distant sound of something passing outside, these are all the present offers. And so the mind, finding itself relatively unoccupied by immediate reality, turns to its secondary occupation, the future. This is worth holding, not in order to judge it, not to find it excessive or to wish it were different, simply to recognize its depth and its logic. When you find yourself lying awake, constructing an imagined scene for the third or fourth or 10th time, replaying a conversation that exists only as possibility, reaching for resolution that keeps receding, you are doing something that is both ancient and sophisticated. You are doing what human beings have always done in the dark, reaching forward, preparing, imagining the shape of what might come so that it might, perhaps, be met with something other than total surprise. The question worth sitting with is not whether we should do this. The question is what it means, what it costs, what it reveals about the relationship between the mind and time, between consciousness and uncertainty, between the self that exists now and the self that is perpetually being constructed in the imagination of a possible future. And that question opens quietly into something much larger, much more interesting, and worth following slowly through the rest of the night. There is one more dimension of this forward-projecting quality worth sitting with before we move on. When Heidegger described the human being as thrown into existence, he meant something specific and somewhat humbling. We did not choose the conditions of our arrival. We did not select our bodies, our families, the historical moment we were born into, the culture that shaped our earliest sense of what is real and what matters. We were, in his language, thrown, and the projection into future possibilities that occupies the mind at night is, in some ways, the mind's response to this thrownness. It is the part of consciousness that is attempting to exercise some degree of authorship over what comes next, given that it had no authorship over what came before. This is not a small thing. The imagined future is partly the mind's way of asserting that it is not simply a product of its conditions, that it is not only what it has been made by circumstance to be, that there is a self here that can shape what comes next, even if it could not shape what came before. The scenarios being rehearsed are not only preparations for specific events. They are also, in their way, expressions of the belief that the future is genuinely open, that choice is genuinely possible, that the self is not entirely determined by the forces that have shaped it so far. This belief is worth holding, even in the quiet hours when the mind is exhausted by its own projecting. The reaching forward is not only anxiety, it is also something like hope. Not the uncritical hope that everything will go well, but the deeper and more durable hope that the future is genuinely open, that what has not yet happened is not already determined, that something real remains possible. This quality of reaching, when it is held with some lightness, is one of the most distinctively human qualities there is. The animal does not reach forward into imagined possibility. The stone does not project itself into what it might become. Only a consciousness capable of genuine self-reflection, capable of standing at some distance from its own immediate experience and imagining what else might be possible, does what the mind does in the quiet hours of a long and sleepless night. And there is one further thing worth noticing before leaving this first territory. The imagined futures that the mind produces at night are not random. They cluster around the things that matter most, around the relationships where there is genuine investment, the work that carries genuine meaning, the decisions that feel as though they touch something central to the question of who we are and what our life is for. The mind does not lie awake, rehearsing trivial conversations or imagining the outcomes of small decisions. It reserves its nocturnal energy for the things that carry weight. And this, in its own way, is a kind of honesty. The nighttime mind reveals through the scenarios it cannot put down exactly where the genuine concerns of a life are located. It shows us, with considerable accuracy, what we care about. And caring, as Heidegger understood, is not a weakness. It is the structure of a life that is actually lived. There is a young professional, somewhere in his late 20s, who lies awake most nights before any significant conversation. Not in dread exactly, though dread is somewhere in the room. More in a state of concentrated preparation. He runs the conversation forward, inventing the other person's responses, testing his own words, adjusting the tone, removing a phrase that might come across as defensive, adding one that might convey confidence without arrogance, starting again from the beginning when something feels wrong. By the time he finally falls asleep, he has already had the conversation dozens of times in his mind. He has been thorough. He has been diligent. He has covered the important possibilities. And yet the conversation, when it arrives, almost never goes the way he imagined. The other person says something unexpected in the first 30 seconds, something that shifts the entire context. The tone he had carefully prepared is slightly wrong for the actual room. His rehearsed lines either do not arise or arrive in the wrong moment and fall flat or feel forced. He adapts, as people do, because adaptation is what he is actually good at, and the conversation concludes reasonably well. But the dozens of hours spent in rehearsal seem, looking back, to have been only loosely connected to what actually occurred. This is one of the central observations of Stoic philosophy. The Stoics were not opposed to preparation. They were not advocates of passivity or indifference to outcomes. Marcus Aurelius, who was both a Stoic philosopher and the emperor of Rome, spent considerable time thinking about how to act well in difficult circumstances. He prepared. He thought ahead. But he returned constantly, in his private journals, to a distinction that he considered foundational, the distinction between what is within his power and what is not. Epictetus, who had been enslaved in his early life and came to Stoic philosophy not as an academic exercise, but as a genuine practice of inner freedom, stated this distinction with characteristic directness. He wrote that some things are in our power and some are not. In our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and whatever is our own action. Not in our power are our body, reputation, office, and whatever is not our own action. And the crucial point, the one worth sitting with carefully, is that the future belongs almost entirely to the second category. The conversation you are rehearsing has not yet occurred, and when it does occur, it will involve another person's reactions, the specific quality of the room, the accumulated mood of both participants, and countless other variables that no amount of mental preparation can determine in advance. The Stoics were making a distinction between the act of preparation, which can be genuinely useful, and the attachment to a particular outcome, which generates a quality of suffering that is independent of whether the outcome actually arrives. You can prepare for a conversation by thinking about what you want to say and why. That is one thing. But when the preparation becomes a demand that the conversation go a particular way, when the mental rehearsal is driven not by genuine curiosity about the situation, but by a need to predetermine the outcome, something has changed. The preparation has become a negotiation with a future that is not available to negotiate. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, in letters that have survived intact for nearly 2,000 years, made an observation about the relationship between anticipation and suffering. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. The Latin carries a precision that most translations only approximate. He was not saying that imagination is not painful. Clearly it is, or people would not lie awake in it. He was saying that the imagination generates a quality of suffering that tends to be in excess of what the actual event produces, because the imagined version has no natural boundary. It expands to fill the space available. It generates new dimensions of concern with each iteration. The actual event, however difficult, is particular and finite. It occupies a specific time, has a specific texture, and eventually ends. The imagined version has no such limitation. Think of something you have genuinely dreaded. A medical appointment, a confrontation that had been building for months, a moment of professional exposure. How many hours did you spend in the imagined version of it, running through its worst possibilities, inhabiting its anticipated discomforts? And when the actual event arrived, when the real thing happened rather than the imagined one, how often did you find that the reality, however difficult, had a different quality than the dread? It was concrete. It was happening to you rather than being imagined by you. It demanded your actual presence rather than your anticipatory preparation. And it ended. The imagined version had been something else entirely. Diffuse, expanding, capable of incorporating new fears as fast as old ones were addressed. The rehearsed conversation can always, in imagination, take a worse turn. There is always another way it could go badly, another angle that has not yet been prepared for, another response that could make things more complicated. The mind that is seeking resolution through rehearsal is seeking something the rehearsal cannot provide, because imagination is generative rather than delimiting. It does not close possibilities. It opens them. Freud noticed this in a particular way. He described certain kinds of repetitive thinking as the mind's attempt to transform a passive experience into an active one. When something is uncertain, when it is happening to us, rather than being determined by us, a particular quality of distress arises. The feeling is one of being subject to forces beyond our influence. The rehearsal, the mental running forward of scenarios, is partly an attempt to convert that passivity into agency. By imagining the scenario, by playing both parts, by directing the mental theatre, the mind creates a felt sense of authorship over something it cannot actually control. The sensation is one of doing something about the situation, even when the doing is only imaginary. There is genuine relief in this felt agency, however temporary. The mind that is rehearsing the difficult conversation feels less helpless than the mind that is simply sitting with its uncertainty. The rehearsal creates the sensation of forward motion, the feeling of work being done, ground being covered, preparation being made. And this sensation is not entirely false. Some preparation is genuinely useful. Working out in advance what you actually want to say can help. Thinking through the other person's likely perspective can deepen empathy and improve the quality of actual conversation. The preparation is not worthless. The question is whether the particular quality of late-night rehearsal, that urgent, repetitive, resolution-seeking quality, is actually producing the useful preparation, or whether it crossed that threshold some time ago and has since been generating something else entirely. The Stoics would offer a gentle redirecting here. Rather than asking whether the imagined conversation is well prepared, they would ask, what is actually within your power here? The answer is probably something like the clarity of your own intentions, the quality of your listening when the actual conversation occurs, your willingness to be honest about your own perspective and genuinely open to theirs. That is the territory of the controllable. The other person's reactions, the specific way the conversation unfolds, the outcome in terms of whether things resolve in the way you hope, these are not in the same territory. And the suffering that attaches to the rehearsal is largely the suffering of a mind that has not yet made this distinction, that is spending its energy trying to predetermine something that is not available to be predetermined. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the Meditations, returned to this point with striking regularity. He was surrounded by people whose behavior he found frustrating, whose decisions he could not control, whose reactions did not always reflect the values he was trying to embody. And he kept arriving at the same observation. What others do is not in my power. What I do, how I respond, what I bring to the encounter, these are within my power. He did not arrive at this conclusion once and then move on. He had to keep arriving at it, which suggests something important. The recognition that the future is beyond control does not come as a single revelation and then stay settled. It is a recognition that has to be made again and again, in each new situation, each new anticipation. The Stoics also practiced something they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. This is often misunderstood as a technique for inducing pessimism or for dwelling in worst-case scenarios. It is something more specific. By imagining, deliberately, and with some care, the worst plausible outcome of a situation, the Stoic practitioner was attempting to do two things. First, to loosen the grip of attachment to preferred outcomes by discovering that the worst outcome is more survivable in imagination than the anxiety about it suggests. And second, to allow the mind to discover its own resilience. The person who has sat with the imagined failure, the imagined rejection, the imagined difficult conversation gone badly, and found that they survived it in imagination, has discovered something about their own capacity that the avoidance of such imagining could not reveal. This is a different relationship to imagined futures than the one most of us maintain in the quiet hours of the night. Most nighttime rehearsal is oriented toward preferred outcomes. We are trying to find the version of events that feels safe, the word arrangement that will produce the right response, the scenario in which things go well. The Stoics would gently suggest a different approach. Consider the version that does not go well. Sit with it. Notice that you survive it in imagination, and that this survival reflects a real capacity. Notice that the imagined failure, when it is held clearly rather than avoided, tends to be smaller than the anxiety about it. But perhaps, for tonight, simply noticing the quality of the rehearsal is enough. Simply sitting with the recognition that what feels like preparation is also, in part, the mind's attempt to manufacture certainty in a space that cannot hold it. The future is open. It is genuinely, irresolvably open, and no amount of mental simulation will close it before it arrives. The room is still. The darkness holds everything equally. Let the mind do what it does, but somewhere in the noticing, something slightly different may become available. Not resolution, something closer to acceptance. The acceptance that the future is not available tonight, that it will arrive when it arrives, and that the self that meets it will be capable of more than the anxious rehearsal currently believes. There is something worth dwelling with in this idea of capability. The mind that is running its rehearsals in the small hours is, in some sense, not trusting itself. Not trusting that when the actual conversation arrives, the actual self will find actual words that are adequate to the actual moment. The rehearsal is partly a vote of no confidence in the present self's ability to respond genuinely, in real time, to real circumstances. It is as though the mind believes that only the prepared self, the self that has covered every possibility in advance, will be sufficient. The spontaneous self, the self that simply responds to what is actually happening, is treated as though it cannot be trusted. And yet, when you consider the actual conversations that have gone well in your life, the moments of genuine connection, the exchanges that were meaningful, they were almost never the ones that were most thoroughly rehearsed. The rehearsed version of a conversation tends to produce a quality of performance, a slight unreality, a sense in both participants that something scripted is being delivered rather than something genuinely felt. The conversations that matter tend to arise from genuine presence, from actually listening to what the other person is saying and responding to it honestly, from allowing the moment to unfold rather than directing it toward a predetermined destination. This is not an argument against all preparation, but it is an observation about the difference between preparing your intentions, your honesty, your genuine desire for a good outcome, and preparing your performance. The former is genuinely useful and probably undervalued. The latter is the kind of preparation that the midnight rehearsal tends to produce, and it tends to produce a quality of interaction that is paradoxically less connected than the unprepared kind. There is a woman sitting on a late train. The city has thinned at the windows, giving way to dark fields and the occasional scattered light of a farmhouse. She has been offered a new position at work, something she has wanted for some time, and she should, by ordinary logic, feel something like satisfaction. Instead, she is 3 months ahead of herself. She is already in the new role, testing whether it feels right, imagining the specific texture of a Tuesday morning in the unfamiliar office, wondering whether the colleagues she is leaving will matter more to her than she currently expects, anticipating the possibility that the thing she has wanted will be subtly disappointing once she has it. The offered position is entirely real. The dissatisfaction she is currently feeling is entirely imaginary. And yet the imaginary feeling is in some ways more present to her than the real one. This quality of reaching ahead, of inhabiting preferred futures before they arrive, and finding in that inhabiting a particular kind of suffering, is what Buddhist philosophy identifies as one of the central mechanisms of mental anguish. The Pali concept of upadana, often translated as clinging or grasping or attachment, describes the mind's tendency to grip an anticipated outcome and derive from that gripping a quality of restlessness that does not resolve until the outcome arrives, and sometimes not even then. The Buddhist analysis is subtle enough to deserve some careful attention, because it is frequently misunderstood as a counsel of indifference. It does not say that the future should be irrelevant to the mind. It does not say that planning is a mistake, that caring about outcomes is foolish, or that the right way to live is without hope or preference. What it says is something more precise, that the quality of consciousness with which we relate to future possibilities contains, in most cases, a kind of grasping, a wanting things to be a particular way that is already, in its very structure, the seed of a particular kind of suffering. The Pali word tanha appears throughout the earliest Buddhist texts. It is usually translated as craving or thirst. The image of thirst is instructive. Thirst is not simply the desire for water. It is the quality of urgent, uncomfortable wanting that arises when something the body requires is not immediately available. The mind that is lying awake rehearsing a future conversation is, in this sense, thirsty. It wants the meeting to go well. It wants the relationship to develop in a particular direction. It wants the decision to turn out to have been the right one. It wants certainty, resolution, the settled feeling of a future that has already been successfully navigated. And because none of these things are present, because they exist only as possibilities that may or may not materialize, the wanting generates a restlessness that keeps cycling through scenario after scenario in search of what it needs. What is important to notice here is that the attachment is not to the future event itself. It is to a particular version of the future event. The mind does not simply think about tomorrow's conversation. It wants tomorrow's conversation to go a specific way. The distinction is significant. A mind that was simply curious about tomorrow, that was genuinely open to how it might unfold, would not be lying awake at 2 a.m. rehearsing it. The rehearsal is driven by preference, by a leaning toward one outcome and away from others, by the specific quality of wanting rather than simply of attending. And the grasping generates activity. The more strongly the mind is attached to a particular version of the future, the more it returns to that future, the more it tests and retests the scenario, the more it turns the same variables over in different combinations, looking for the arrangement that will produce the settled feeling of having secured the preferred outcome. Each iteration generates a small spike of relief when it produces a version that feels good, followed by a return of unease when the mind remembers that the version is imaginary and the actual event is still undetermined. The relief is temporary. The unease is waiting. There is something genuinely poignant in this. The person rehearsing tomorrow's difficult conversation is not trying to suffer. They are trying, in the way available to them, to take care of themselves, to reduce uncertainty, to prepare. The care is real. The intention is good. And yet the preparation itself, driven as it is by attachment to a preferred outcome, generates the very state they are trying to avoid. The mind tightens around the imagined scenario because it wants something from it, and the tightening is precisely what keeps it awake. The Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah once described the relationship between grasping and peace with a simplicity that can stop the mind entirely if encountered at the right moment. If you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace. Notice that this is not about caring less or becoming indifferent to outcomes. It is about the quality of the holding. The peace described is not the peace of someone who has stopped wanting anything. It is the peace of a mind that relates to its wanting with some degree of openness, that can hold the preference without being gripped by it. Notice how that idea sits. There is a quality of mind that can hold the future lightly, that can think about tomorrow, consider its possibilities, prepare where preparation is genuinely useful, and then, at some point, release the outcome. Not with the forced acceptance of someone who is suppressing their real concern, but with something more like genuine trust. The trust that the actual event, when it arrives, will be workable. That whatever happens will be something the self can engage with, respond to, learn from. That the future does not need to be pre-lived in order to be survived. This is genuinely difficult. The mind does not experience the releasing as optional. The rehearsal does not feel voluntary. It feels necessary, urgent, as though stopping would leave something unprepared, as though releasing the scenario would be a kind of abandonment of responsibility for one's own life. The urgency is real. The question worth sitting with is whether the urgency accurately reflects the situation, or whether it is the grasping mind mistaking its own anxiety for a genuine requirement. Buddhist thought is remarkable for its compassion toward the grasping quality of the mind. The tradition does not treat grasping as a moral failure or a personal weakness. It treats it as the predictable result of an untrained mind encountering the conditions of existence. Of course, the mind grasps. The mind that has not been given another way to relate to uncertainty will naturally try to resolve that uncertainty through repeated mental engagement with possible outcomes. Grasping is not failure. It is what minds do when they have not been shown another way. The other way, as the Buddhist tradition presents it, is not the suppression of wanting, but a particular quality of awareness. The awareness that can notice the arising of preference without immediately becoming the preference. That can observe the grasping impulse as something the mind is doing, rather than as something the mind is. A meditator practicing basic awareness might watch a thought arise and simply note, wanting. Not this specific want or that specific want, just the bare quality of wanting as an event in consciousness. In this noting, something shifts slightly. The thought is still present, but the identification with it loosens. The wanting is there, but there is also, beside it or underneath it, a space that is not defined by the wanting. A space that is simply aware. The imagined future conversation that arises in the mind at midnight is a thought. It is an event in consciousness. It has a particular quality of urgency and vividness, but it is not the conversation itself. It is the mind's model of a possible conversation, generated by a consciousness that relates to uncertainty by simulating possible versions of the thing it is uncertain about. This is worth holding very gently. The model is not the thing. The imagined version is not the actual event. Both of these things can be true at the same time. The imagined conversation can feel extremely real and pressing, and it can also be, at the same time, a model, a simulation, a story the mind is telling itself about something that has not yet happened and may not happen in any recognizable form. The Buddhist tradition would not say, "Stop imagining." It would say, "Notice that you are imagining." There is a difference between the mind that is consumed by its simulation and the mind that can observe its own simulation with some degree of clarity. The latter is not less engaged with the future. It is engaged differently. It holds the imagined scenario with somewhat less urgency, somewhat more lightness, somewhat more of the basic recognition that the model is not the thing. The blanket has a weight, the pillow has a particular texture. The room holds its darkness quietly and completely. These are present. The conversation that is being rehearsed is not here yet. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. The mind can be aware of its own imagining, and the body can rest in the actual present. And somewhere in that gap between the two, a small and genuine spaciousness may open. Not resolution, not the settled clarity of having secured the preferred outcome. Something quieter than that. Something that does not require the future to cooperate. It is worth noticing, as you lie still, that the body is not actually suffering tonight. The difficulty that is being rehearsed has not yet arrived. The conversation that is being prepared for is not yet happening. The decision that is being turned over has not yet been made, and its consequences are not yet being felt. Right now, in this actual moment, the situation is manageable. The only suffering present is the suffering generated by the imagining of suffering that might arrive. And the imagining, as the Buddhist tradition has consistently observed, is the grasping mind mistaking its own projections for the actual texture of experience. There is a quality of awareness that can hold this recognition without making it into another thing to grasp for. Not, I must stop imagining and be present, but more simply, this is imagining, and the body is here, and both can be true, and neither needs to be resolved right now. The imagining can continue if it will. The body can rest in the actual present if it can. And somewhere in the allowing of both, without forcing a resolution, something may begin, of its own accord, to settle. There is something particular that happens in the mind at night, something that goes beyond rehearsing tomorrow's meeting or preparing for next week's difficult conversation. Sometimes the imagined scenarios are larger than that. They reach further forward, into configurations of life that are not simply tomorrow's challenges, but possible futures entirely, lives that could be lived, selves that could be inhabited, paths that have not yet been taken and may never be. The mind moves through these larger possibilities with a quality that is distinct from the anxious rehearsal of anticipated difficulties. It is more exploratory, more curious, more willing to linger in a possibility just long enough to feel its full texture before moving to another. A person imagines themselves in a different city, with a different set of morning routines, a different view from a window they have never stood at, or they imagine a different professional identity, one in which the work feels genuinely meaningful rather than merely competent. Or they imagine a version of a relationship that is different from the one they are in, or will be in, and they inhabit that version long enough to notice how it feels, what it offers, what it would cost. These imagined futures are not, in most cases, plans. They are something more like explorations. The mind is not deciding anything. It is testing, probing, discovering what different configurations of a possible self would feel like from the inside. Carl Jung was deeply interested in this quality of the psyche. Where Freud was concerned primarily with the past, with the origins of psychological patterns in early experience, and the way repressed material shapes current behavior, Jung was equally interested in what he called the teleological dimension of the unconscious, its orientation not only backward toward its origins, but forward toward its potential. The psyche, in Jung's understanding, is not simply managing past wounds or present anxieties. It is also engaged in a perpetual exploration of what it might become. Jung proposed the individuation process as the central psychological work of a human life. Individuation is not a simple or linear thing. It is the gradual, lifelong work of becoming more fully oneself, of integrating the various dimensions of the personality rather than suppressing some in favor of others, of allowing the full range of what one is to find expression in an actual life. And central to this process, in Jung's understanding, is the psyche's ongoing exploration of possible selves, the imagined futures that arise at night, the fantasies of different lives, different choices, different configurations of identity, are not idle distractions. They are the psyche doing its deeper work. They are the unconscious holding open the question of what is possible, of what dimensions of the self remain unlived. Jung wrote about what he called the shadow, the aspects of the personality that have been set aside, repressed, or simply never activated in the course of forming a particular identity. The shadow is not simply the negative or the destructive, though it can include those things. It also contains the unlived life, the capacities not developed, the paths not taken, the qualities suppressed in the service of becoming a particular kind of person in a particular kind of world. A person who has spent many years being reliable and responsible may find, arising unexpectedly in the quiet of the night, fantasies of irresponsibility, of risk, of radical departure from the established self. A person who has constructed a very controlled and careful exterior may find the imagined futures returning repeatedly to something wilder, less managed, more genuinely expressive. These are not simply the escapist fantasies of an unhappy person. They are the shadow asserting its presence, the unlived life making its case. The nighttime imagination, with its freedom from the constraints of daytime practicality and social presentation, is one of the spaces where the shadow surfaces, where the unlived life asserts its presence, where the psyche is free to explore what the managed, curated, socially appropriate daytime self does not allow. This is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. The imagined futures that feel most alive, most vivid, most insistently recurring, may be pointing toward something genuinely important about what the actual life is missing. Think of the person who has spent 15 years building a career in a field they entered practically rather than passionately, who finds themselves, in the quiet before sleep, repeatedly drawn to imagined versions of a different professional life. They are not simply being restless or ungrateful. They are not simply escaping the difficulties of the present. The psyche is doing something it requires, holding open the question of what else might be possible, maintaining contact with dimensions of the self that the chosen life has not yet had the opportunity to express. Whether or not anything is done about this in the actual world, the imagining is serving a function. It is keeping something alive. The existentialist tradition has its own, more austere way of engaging with this experience. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, described what he called the anguish of freedom. His argument was that human beings are genuinely free, more genuinely free than the comfortable stories we tell about ourselves usually acknowledge. We are not fixed entities with predetermined essences. There is no human nature, in the classical sense, that tells us what we must become. We become through the accumulation of our actual choices. And this genuine freedom, rather than feeling liberating, tends to feel heavy. It feels heavy because every choice is, simultaneously, the exclusion of every other choice. Every path taken is every other path abandoned. Every version of the self that is actualized is every other version left unlived. Sartre's thought is often misrepresented as a kind of harsh individualism, a philosophy of radical self-creation without support. But what he was actually describing was something more honest, and in some ways more uncomfortable. The experience of being genuinely responsible for the shape of one's own life, the imagined future selves, the alternative possibilities explored in the quiet of the night, are in this sense a confrontation with freedom. The mind is testing the range of what is possible, and in doing so, it is also encountering the weight of the choices that would be required to actualize any of them. Søren Kierkegaard, writing in the 19th century in a tradition that Sartre would later develop, described the experience of genuine possibility with a phrase that has a particular accuracy: the dizziness of freedom. The image is precise. When you stand at the edge of a genuine choice, when the future is genuinely open and genuinely yours to shape, the sensation is not simply one of opportunity. It is also, in an almost physical sense, vertiginous. The openness itself is what unsettles. The freedom is real, and the freedom is also the source of a specific kind of anxiety that no amount of preparation or rehearsal can entirely resolve, because the anxiety is not about the specific outcome, but about the condition of freedom itself. This is why imagined futures at night so often feel both alluring and exhausting. Alluring because they represent genuine possibility, genuine dimensions of the self not yet actualized, genuine life not yet lived. Exhausting because each one carries with it the weight of what would need to be released in order to pursue it. The imagined future in the different city requires leaving this one. The imagined version of the more meaningful work requires giving something up. The imagined self that is braver, more expressive, less careful, requires the actual self to become braver, more expressive, less careful, and the actual self, in its current form, may not feel ready for that. Jung had something important to say about resolution here, though it is not the resolution the anxious mind tends to want. He did not believe that the tension between possible selves could be resolved by choice alone, that it was simply a matter of deciding clearly and committing fully. The individuation process, in his understanding, is lifelong. The work is not to choose one possible self and permanently abandon all others. It is to remain in conversation with the full range of what one might be, to allow that range to inform how one actually lives, to bring as much of the unlived life into the lived life as the actual circumstances of an existence allow. This will not dissolve the anguish that Sartre described, but it places it in a different context. The multiplicity of possible selves is not a problem to be solved by clarity of decision. It is a feature of being human, a feature worth being curious about rather than trying to resolve in the middle of the night. The imagined futures are the psyche exploring its own range. They are valuable in that exploration. They are not necessarily instructions. There is a particular quality to the mind when it is genuinely curious about its own possibilities rather than anxious about its choices. The curiosity is lighter, more spacious. The imagined scenarios feel more like genuine explorations than urgent rehearsals. The futures are held with some openness, some genuine wondering, rather than with the tight grip of someone who needs to determine the correct answer before sleep is allowed to come. You may notice this distinction in your own experience. Some imagined futures are held tightly, pursued relentlessly through the night, turned over and over in search of a resolution that keeps receding. Others arise more gently, are entertained with something approaching pleasure, are allowed to unfold, and then dissolve without demanding a decision. The latter are closer to what Jung was describing, the psyche at play in the landscape of its own possibilities, doing the kind of exploration that is nourishing rather than depleting. The room is quiet. The imagined futures are present, perhaps several of them, perhaps competing, perhaps arising one from another, in long chains of associated possibility. Let them be present without requiring them to immediately become decisions. They are the mind's way of remaining alive to what it contains, alive to the full range of what this particular human life might yet become. That is something. That is worth noticing without immediately resolving. There is something else in the Jungian perspective that is worth sitting with quietly. Jung believed that the images arising in the imagination, particularly in the drowsy, unguarded space between waking and sleep, are not simply the products of personal anxiety or individual history. They are also, in his understanding, expressions of what he called the collective unconscious, a deep layer of psychic life that is not personal but shared, not individual but human, containing the accumulated symbolic inheritance of the entire species. The imagined futures that feel most vivid, most charged with meaning, most insistently present, may be touching something in this deeper layer. They may be speaking in the language of what Jung called archetypes, patterns of experience so fundamental and so recurring across all human cultures that they have their own symbolic grammar. The figure you keep imagining yourself speaking to, the authority whose approval is being sought in the rehearsed conversation, the mentor or rival or beloved whose imagined response determines the emotional quality of the entire scenario. These figures may be more than representations of actual people in your life. They may be carrying archetypal weight. The authority figure may be carrying the archetype of the father, the judge, the keeper of standards. The rival may be carrying the shadow. The beloved may be carrying something that belongs as much to the imagination as to any actual relationship. This is not a counsel to become suspicious of your own imagined scenarios, but it is an invitation to hold them with somewhat more curiosity and somewhat less literalism. The conversation being rehearsed is real in the sense that it involves real people and real circumstances, but it is also always a construction of the imagining mind, shaped by layers of meaning that go deeper than the specific situation. What is being sought in the imagined exchange may be something much older and more fundamental than the actual conversation can provide. And recognizing this, gently, without conclusion, can loosen something in the urgency of the rehearsal. There is a particular sensation that accompanies the imagining of future scenarios, something that is not quite dread and not quite excitement, but inhabits a space between them with its own distinct character. It is the sensation of not knowing, of holding a situation in the mind while being unable to determine its outcome, of facing something genuinely open, something that could resolve in any number of directions, none of which can be confirmed in advance. Uncertainty has a physical quality. You may recognize it as a slight tension somewhere in the chest, or a particular restlessness in the legs or hands, or a quality of alertness in the mind that resists the body's movement toward rest. The uncertainty is not simply an intellectual state, an abstract recognition that certain things are not yet known. It registers in the nervous system as something that requires a response, as though the unknown outcome were itself a kind of threat requiring readiness. This physiological response is not irrational. The nervous system evolved under conditions in which uncertainty frequently meant danger. The uncertain sound in the dark, the unfamiliar quality of an approaching situation, the unknown intentions of a stranger. These were, for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, genuine threats that required genuine physical readiness. The body that responded to uncertainty with alertness and preparation was better positioned to survive it than the body that responded with indifference. The wakefulness that uncertainty produces is the nervous system doing exactly what its long history has prepared it to do. But the uncertainty that most of us carry through the modern night has a different character, even when the body's response to it is similar. It is the uncertainty of open questions rather than immediate physical threats. Will this relationship find its natural shape? Will this career eventually produce the meaning it was entered with? Will the choices being made now look wise or foolish when seen from a greater distance? Will the person I am becoming be someone the person I am now would recognize and respect? These are genuine questions. They are not trivial, but they are not, in most cases, threats in the evolutionary sense. They are the questions that arise from being a conscious, self-aware creature who knows that the future is real and that it will contain the consequences of current choices, but who cannot see it from where they currently stand. These questions have no answers yet. They cannot be resolved through rehearsal. They will be answered, if they are answered at all, only by the actual passage of time and the accumulation of actual events. The actual conversation will happen, and then it will be known how it went. The actual decision will be made, and time will reveal whether it was wise. The relationship will unfold in its actual way, and the unfolding will provide information that the imagining cannot supply. And yet the mind, in the quiet of the night, keeps returning to these questions, keeps turning them over, keeps testing possible answers against the available evidence, knowing somewhere in the turning that the evidence is insufficient and the answers are not yet available. The existentialist philosophers had a particular sensitivity to this quality of experience. Albert Camus, writing in the early 1940s in a France occupied by a foreign power, surrounded by circumstances of genuine uncertainty and genuine danger, described what he called the absurd condition. The absurd, in his precise use of the word, is not a characteristic of the world alone, nor a characteristic of human consciousness alone, but the relationship between them. Human consciousness has a deep desire for clarity, for meaning, for coherent narrative, and the world, in Camus' understanding, is genuinely indifferent to this desire. It does not provide the clarity being sought. It does not guarantee that the meaning imposed on events will hold. It does not confirm or deny the stories we tell about what our lives are for. The absurd is the gap between the human need for meaning and the world's silence on the subject, and the experience of lying awake, turning uncertain futures over in the mind without arriving at the resolution being sought, is one of the most immediate and common encounters with this gap. The mind is asking questions that the future is not yet prepared to answer. It is, in Camus's language, calling out to the world and receiving no reply. Camus was not despairing about this. His response to the absurd condition was not resignation or nihilism, but what he called revolt, a determined, clear-eyed engagement with life in spite of its uncertainty, a refusal to pretend that the questions are answered when they are not, combined with an equally determined refusal to be paralyzed by their openness. He wrote of living without appeal, of committing to the present moment in the full knowledge that certainty is not on offer, and that this lack of certainty is simply the actual condition of an actual life. There is something steady in this, though it takes time to settle into it. The person who has genuinely accepted that the future is uncertain, who has integrated this acceptance rather than simply understood it intellectually on a good afternoon, and then forgotten it by midnight, is in some ways more genuinely at ease than the person who believes certainty is available and is simply waiting for it to arrive through more thorough preparation. The searching for certainty in the mental rehearsal of future scenarios is partly the mind's attempt to answer questions before the universe is ready to answer them. The peace that Camus gestures toward is the peace of a different relationship to the questions themselves. The philosopher Paul Tillich, writing from within a different tradition, but attending to the same fundamental experience, described what he called the courage to be. Tillich was interested in what he saw as the ontological anxiety of human existence, not the anxiety of specific threats or anticipated difficulties, but the anxiety that arises simply from being a finite, contingent creature in an open-ended universe. This anxiety, he argued, cannot be eliminated through any amount of preparation or understanding. It can only be met with courage. The courage to continue engaging with life in the full awareness that it offers no guarantees. The courage to make choices in the genuine absence of certainty about their consequences. The courage to inhabit the present moment rather than perpetually retreating into the safer, imaginative territory of a future that has already been determined. Heidegger returned to the question from yet another direction. He described what he called thrownness, Geworfenheit in German, the sense in which human beings find themselves already in a situation they did not choose, already in a particular body, a particular family, a particular historical moment, a particular set of circumstances that preceded and shaped their reflective awareness. There is no moment of pure beginning in which we stand before life with complete freedom and simply choose. We are always already in the middle of something, already committed to the circumstances of a life that was underway before we became fully conscious of it. And yet within this thrownness, within the unchosen circumstances of an already ongoing life, there is genuine freedom. Sartre's insistence on this, his famous claim that existence precedes essence, was precisely an assertion of this freedom in the face of thrownness. We do not have a fixed nature that determines what we must become. The self is not an essence waiting to be discovered and expressed. The self is being made continuously in the actual choices made in actual circumstances. The future self is genuinely open. It is being shaped right now, including in the choice of how to relate to the uncertainty that is being experienced right now. The anxiety that attaches to this openness is real. It is not the result of incorrect thinking or excessive sensitivity. It is the accurate recognition that the future is genuinely undetermined, that choices have genuine consequences, that things could genuinely go in different directions, and that no amount of preparation guarantees a particular outcome. This accuracy is what makes the anxiety legitimate. The mind that feels this anxiety is, in a sense, correctly perceiving the situation. The question is not how to make the perception false, how to believe that certainty is available when it is not. The question is how to relate to accurate perception in a way that does not generate endless cycles of rehearsal and return. And here the existentialists are perhaps less useful than they are honest. They describe the anxiety clearly. They name its sources accurately. They resist the temptation to provide false consolation. But they do not resolve it. They suggest, with varying degrees of emphasis, the importance of living forward anyway, of making choices in the genuine absence of guarantee, of inhabiting the uncertainty with something approaching, if not comfort, then at least willingness. The blanket has a weight. The breath continues its rhythm. The darkness holds the room without comment. Outside, something moves in its ordinary way, indifferent to the questions being turned over inside. The uncertainty that is generating all this mental activity is real. It is not going to be resolved tonight. The future will arrive in its own form, shaped by factors that the rehearsal cannot fully anticipate, carrying information that will only be available when the events actually occur. Sitting with this has a particular quality. Not immediately restful, but perhaps over the length of a long, quiet night, something settles. The mind recognizes that the rehearsal is not going to arrive at the certainty being sought, and somewhere in that recognition, not as defeat, but as something more like honest clarity, a different kind of rest may become available. There is a philosopher of time named J.M.E. McTaggart, who made a distinction that has been argued about ever since, but that illuminates something about the experience of lying awake in anticipation. He distinguished between what he called the A series of time, which is the series of past, present, and future, in which things are described as having happened, or being happening now, or being about to happen, and the B series, in which things are simply described as being earlier or later than each other, without any privileged present moment. The future that is being rehearsed so insistently tonight is a feature of the A series. It is real in a particular way. It is coming. It has a direction. It will arrive. And the mind, oriented as it is toward the A series of time, toward the lived experience of before and now and after, cannot simply set this aside. The future matters because it is coming, because it will be the present, because right now it is the not yet that will soon be the here. And yet, there is something in the contemplation of the B-series that can, on certain nights, introduce a small degree of perspective. The conversation that is currently being imagined as a future event will, from the vantage point of a few weeks from now, be a past event. It will have its place in the fixed and unalterable sequence of things that have already occurred. Its outcome will be known. Its texture will be available to memory rather than to anticipation. And from that vantage point, the current night's rehearsal will appear as something that happened before the event, as the anticipation that preceded the reality, as one of those periods of tension that every significant moment in a life carries in advance of itself. This is not a technique for relieving anxiety. It is more of an observation about the quality of temporal experience. The event being anticipated is not only a future event, it is also, from another angle of vision, a past event that has simply not yet become past. It already has its place in the sequence of your life. The outcome already exists, in some sense, in the structure of events that are going to unfold. This evening's rehearsal and the actual conversation and its resolution are all, from a sufficiently distant vantage point, already settled into their places in the story. The suffering of not knowing is, from that perspective, one of the rooms in a house that has already been built. You are in that room now. You will move through it into the next one. There is something, if not comforting, then at least interesting in this. The uncertainty that feels so open, so genuinely undetermined, is also, from a perspective not currently available, already resolved, not in a way that removes the uncertainty now, but in a way that is worth holding lightly, as a reminder that the current moment is not the entirety of the situation. The night will end. The conversation will happen. The decision will be made. Life will continue to unfold in the direction that it is going to unfold. And the mind that is currently lying awake preparing for it will have been one moment in that unfolding, one room in the house, one night in a life that continues past this particular point of tension. Somewhere in the classical Chinese text, known as the Tao Te Ching, attributed to the sage Laozi, and composed in a period whose precise dating remains uncertain, there is a passage that has been translated and retranslated for centuries without losing its essential quality. It describes a way of being in the world that does not force, does not grasp, does not insist on particular outcomes. It points towards something that most modern minds find genuinely difficult to approach, not because it is obscure or requires special knowledge, but because it runs so directly against the grain of how contemporary consciousness has been shaped to relate to time and uncertainty and the future. The word at the center of this Taoist understanding is Wu Wei. In its most common translation, it becomes non-action, though this is misleading because it sounds like passivity, which is not what is meant. Other translations offer effortless action, or not forcing, or acting in accord with what is naturally unfolding. None of these translations fully captures what is being pointed at, but each of them gestures toward the same underlying quality, a relationship with life that is responsive rather than controlling, that moves with what is arising rather than perpetually attempting to determine in advance what will arise. This is not an invitation to stop thinking or planning or caring about how things go. The Tao Te Ching is full of paradoxes, and one of the central ones is that Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing. The text offers many images of this quality in action. Water does nothing to wear away the stone. There is no force, no determination, no insistence on a particular outcome. And yet the stone yields to it completely. The tree that bends in the storm does not stop being a tree. The bending is not failure. It is the form that survival takes. The sage who follows the Tao is not inactive. They are, in many of the text's images, extraordinarily effective. But their effectiveness comes not from forcing, but from moving with what is, from acting in accord with the natural movement of circumstances rather than against it. Applied to the mind's relationship with future scenarios, this suggests something worth considering slowly and without urgency. What would it mean to allow the future to unfold? Not to stop thinking, not to cease all preparation, not to become genuinely indifferent to outcomes, but to hold the future with a different quality of attention. The quality that is present to what is actually happening, rather than permanently rehearsing what might happen. The quality that can remain curious about the future, without requiring the future to be a specific way. The Tao Te Ching contains this image in one common translation. Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear? The image is quiet and precise. The muddied water does not become clear through continued agitation. The harder you stir it, the longer the mud remains suspended. Clarity comes through stillness, through the patience to allow what has been disturbed to settle on its own terms, in its own time. The intervention that is needed is not more effort, but a different kind of presence. The presence that can wait, that can allow, that does not require the settling to occur faster than it will naturally occur. The mind at 2 a.m, turning its scenarios over and over, is stirring the water. The agitation is sincere. It feels genuinely necessary. And yet the clarity it is seeking is, in the very act of seeking it through agitation, being delayed. The water stirs, the mud rises again, and the mind continues its work, genuinely believing that one more iteration will produce the settlement it needs. There is no instruction here. Understanding does not automatically produce change in the body's learned responses. The knowledge that agitation delays clarity does not, in itself, still the mind that has spent years relating to uncertainty through mental rehearsal. But understanding can, over time and with patient and gentle return, begin to shift something in the quality of the engagement. The mind can hold its scenarios with somewhat less urgency. It can notice the stirring without immediately adding to it. It can perhaps, on certain nights, in certain conditions of sufficient tiredness or sufficient peace, watch the mud settle just a little. The philosopher Alan Watts, who spent much of his life exploring Eastern philosophical traditions in dialogue with Western thought, described a quality he called the wisdom of insecurity. The phrase is paradoxical enough to be worth sitting with carefully. He was not saying that insecurity is something to be cultivated or desired. He was making a more precise and more interesting point, that the attempt to escape insecurity through the construction of mental certainties is, in the end, less stable than a genuine acceptance of insecurity as the actual ground of experience. The person who genuinely accepts that the future is uncertain, who has integrated this, rather than merely understood it on a good afternoon, and then lost it again by midnight, is not more vulnerable than the person who is perpetually rehearsing scenarios in search of a certainty that will make the vulnerability stop. They are, in a paradoxical way, more resilient, because they are not depending on a version of reality that does not yet exist. They are not spending their energy on the management of imagined outcomes that may never arrive in the form being managed. They are, in a way that is difficult to describe but quite recognizable in practice, more genuinely available to respond to whatever actually does arrive. The Tao Te Ching returns repeatedly to what it calls the 10,000 things, the vast, complex, uncontrollable movement of the actual world in all its specific particularity. One of the recurring themes in the text is the inadequacy of the individual human perspective in the face of the full complexity of what actually is. The sage does not claim to know how things will unfold. They hold their understanding lightly, remain genuinely open to revision, remain attentive to what the situation itself is revealing, rather than to what their model of the situation has predicted. This is not stupidity or lack of planning. It is a sophisticated recognition of the limits of what can be known in advance. The scenarios being rehearsed in the quiet hours of the night are based on the information currently available, on the current understanding of the people involved, on the current sense of what matters and what might go wrong. But this understanding is always partial. The actual event, when it arrives, will contain information that the rehearsal could not access. The other person will bring their own inner life, their own concerns and histories and responses that cannot be fully predicted from outside. The context will be slightly different from anything imagined. Something unexpected will introduce itself. The world is richer than any model of it. Other people are more complex than any rehearsal of them. The actual texture of experience is finer and more particular than anything that can be pre-lived in imagination. In this light, the imagined future is not worthless. But its worth lies, perhaps, less in its accuracy, its predictive power, its ability to prepare us for specific events, and more in what it reveals about the mind doing the imagining. The scenarios we construct at night are, in their way, portraits of ourselves. They reveal what we value and what we fear, and what kind of recognition we are reaching for. They reveal where we feel most exposed and most hopeful. They show us, with considerable clarity, what matters to us, and what we are currently unable to simply trust. They are mirrors more than maps. Reading them as mirrors rather than as maps changes the quality of the engagement with them. Instead of evaluating each scenario for its accuracy or its usefulness as preparation, the mind can hold it with more lightness and ask, what does this reveal? What does the fact that I keep returning to this particular imagined conversation tell me about what I most need from this relationship? What does the repetition of this specific imagined failure tell me about where I have not yet found peace? What does the quality of this imagined future reveal about the shape of the present life? These are gentler questions. They do not require the scenario to resolve. They do not require certainty or the successful prediction of outcomes. They invite a kind of self-knowledge that is available in the imagining itself, without the imagining needing to produce any particular result. The imagined future that has been turning in the mind all night may not be preparing you for a real event at all. It may be showing you something about yourself that is worth knowing, something that the daytime mind, occupied with tasks and responses and the management of actual circumstances, does not have the quiet to see. There is a Zen story about a student who comes to a master asking to be taught how to still the mind. The master points at a river and says, "Stop the river." The student does not understand. The master says nothing more for a long time, and then, "You cannot stop the river, but you can change the direction you are facing." The mind moves. It produces thoughts, scenarios, rehearsals, projections, explorations. This is what minds do. Trying to stop it is not the work. Changing the quality of the relationship to it, the direction from which it is met, the degree of identification with its productions, that is something that can, over time, be worked with. So perhaps this is where the night's reflection arrives. Not at a conclusion, because the questions we have been sitting with do not have conclusions of the ordinary sort. More at a different vantage point. A slightly expanded view of what is actually happening in the hours when the mind runs its scenarios. The mind that imagines futures is not misbehaving. It is not a problem requiring correction. It is doing something that is, in its essence, human, reaching forward into possibility, trying to care for itself and for the people it is responsible for, attempting to navigate an uncertain future with whatever resources the present moment offers. The reaching is real. The care is real. The uncertainty that drives the rehearsal is real. And the resources available to meet it are also real, deeper than the rehearsal typically recognizes. The Stoic lens says, much of what is being rehearsed is not within your control, and the rehearsal, however sincere, generates a quality of suffering in excess of what the actual event will likely produce. The distinction between what is yours to determine and what is not is worth returning to, gently, as a practice, rather than a single insight. The Buddhist lens says, the grasping toward preferred outcomes is itself the source of the restlessness, and the mind that can hold the future more lightly, that can notice the wanting without being entirely consumed by it, will find a different and quieter quality of rest available beneath the surface of the imagining. The Heideggerian lens says, this reaching forward into possibility is not a malfunction, but the fundamental shape of what you are, a being that exists as care, as projection, as perpetual movement into what is not yet. You are not doing something wrong. You are doing something irreducibly human. The Jungian lens says, the imagined futures are the psyche exploring the range of what it might become, doing necessary work in the landscape of possibility, and some of what is arising in the imagining is worth attending to rather than dismissing. The unlived life has something to say. The existentialist lens says, the uncertainty that drives the rehearsal is real, and the courage to live within it rather than to resolve it prematurely is one of the genuine forms of human freedom. The anxiety is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence of accurate perception. And the Taoist lens, the last one, the quietest one, says simply, allow. Not as an instruction, not as a technique, not as something to do right now in the hope of immediate results. Just as an observation. The water finds its own level without being directed. The mud settles in its own time without being assisted. The future arrives in its own form, shaped by more than any single mind can simulate. The mind that can rest in this, even briefly, even in just a few moments of genuine acceptance between one thought and the next, has found something that no amount of rehearsal can produce, and no amount of control can secure. The room is still. Whatever sounds exist outside, the distant movement of the world continuing its unscheduled life, the particular quiet of this particular hour in this particular place, have their own rhythm, their own indifferent continuity. The breath moves in and out, not through effort, but through the body's own unhurried necessity. The imagined futures may still be present, arising as they will, running their variations. That is fine. Let them. But there is, underneath them or beside them, or simply available to be noticed alongside them, a different quality of presence. The presence of the actual moment, the weight of the actual body, the genuine reality of a person lying still in the dark, alive, aware, here. Heidegger used the word Augenblick, which translates as the moment of vision, or the glance of an eye, to describe the sudden and complete recognition of one's own existence in its full particularity, in its full presence, as this moment rather than as the imagined next moment, or the anticipated distant future. It is not a dramatic experience. It does not arrive with emphasis. It is simply the awareness, quiet and complete, of being here, in this particular darkness, in this particular body, in this particular moment of a particular life. The future will arrive. It always does. It will be different from how it was imagined, in ways both disappointing and surprising, in ways that no amount of rehearsal could have anticipated. The conversations will happen and not happen. The decisions will be made and unmade. The possible selves imagined in the quiet will either come into being or will not, and the life will continue to unfold in its own unforeseeable way, shaped by things imagined and things not imagined, and things that could not have been imagined at all. And all of that is, in its own way, all right. Not because everything will go well. It may not. Not because uncertainty is not real. It is entirely real. But because the self that will meet whatever arrives is more capable than the midnight rehearsal suggests, more flexible than the anxious scenarios imply, more genuinely present to actual circumstances than the mind that is perpetually pre-living imagined ones. The imagining mind is not the enemy of rest. It is simply the mind doing what minds do, reaching forward, caring, trying. The rest that is available is not the rest of a mind that has stopped imagining. It is the rest of a mind that can hold its imagining a little more lightly, that can notice the reaching without being entirely consumed by it, that can return, every so often, to the simple and complete reality of the present moment, not as an achievement, not as the destination of a practice, simply as something that is always already available, always already here, in the breathing and the weight and the darkness and the ordinary fact of being alive in a specific place at a specific time. Let the breath do what it does. Let the mind do what it does. Let the night hold everything without requiring any of it to be resolved before morning. There is a quality of patience that the Tao Te Ching describes in a way that has no equivalent in the Western philosophical tradition. It is not the patience of waiting for something to arrive. It is more like the patience of the earth, which does not wait for spring, but is simply available for spring when spring comes. The earth does not rehearse the arrival of warmth. It does not prepare specific responses to the lengthening light. It is simply what it is, and the seasons move through it. And this is sufficient. The Taoist tradition is not suggesting that human beings become earth, or that human consciousness, with its extraordinary capacity for anticipation and planning, should be abandoned in favor of something more mineral. But it is suggesting that there is something to be learned from the quality of availability that the natural world embodies. The capacity to be genuinely present to what is, without the perpetual overlay of what might be, what should be, what needs to be different than it is. The philosopher and writer Simone Weil, writing from a contemplative tradition that intersects in interesting ways with Taoist thought, described what she called attention, a particular quality of awareness that is not active in the usual sense, not effortful, not goal-directed, but genuinely open. She distinguished this from the ordinary quality of attention, which is always attention toward something, attention for a purpose, attention in the service of a goal. What she was describing was something more receptive than that, a state of consciousness that is available to what is without immediately converting it into material for analysis or preparation or response. She wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, the mind that attends genuinely to what is, rather than to what it needs or fears, is giving something to the moment that is difficult to describe, but immediately recognizable when it is encountered. The scenario being rehearsed in the quiet of the night is the opposite of this kind of attention. It is the mind turning away from what is toward what might be. It is consciousness organized around a future that does not yet exist, rather than around the present that is fully, quietly, unremarkably here. Not because the present is more important than the future, but because it is the only thing that is actually real right now. The future is real in the sense that it will arrive. The present is real in the sense that it is here. This distinction, held gently rather than as a correction, can introduce something into the texture of a long night. Not an instruction to stop imagining, not a technique for arriving at presence, simply an observation that runs alongside the imagining, available to be noticed when the mind is ready to notice it. The imagined future is real in its way. The present moment is real in its way. Both can be held simultaneously by a consciousness that is not required to choose between them, but can simply be aware of both, can know that it is imagining, while also knowing that the imagining is happening in a present moment that is quiet and safe and complete in itself. There is a phrase in the Zen tradition used to describe the quality of awakened awareness. Just this. Not nothing else besides this. Not this rather than that, but simply this, the bare and complete reality of the present moment in all its ordinary specificity. Just this room, just this breath, just this quality of darkness and silence and the weight of the body resting. The Zen tradition does not ask the mind to stop its activity. It asks only for a recognition of what is actually present underneath the activity, alongside the activity, available in the midst of the activity. Just this. The imagined futures that are turning in the mind are also, in a sense, just this. Just thoughts, just imagining, just the mind doing what minds do. When they are seen clearly as this, as thoughts rather than as realities, as imaginings rather than as events, something in their grip loosens slightly. They are still there, but they are seen for what they are. And what they are, when seen clearly, is not the threatening future they appeared to be. They are simply the mind's activity, which has its own interest and its own value, but which does not need to be mistaken for the actual shape of what is coming. There is enough time. There is, in the end, always enough time. The future is coming, and it will be met when it arrives, with whatever is available in that actual moment, which will be more than this anticipatory darkness believes. Consider how many times in a life you have navigated something you could not have fully prepared for. How many conversations went differently than expected, and were survived anyway. Sometimes even thrived in ways that the preparation would have prevented. How many situations that seemed immovable eventually moved, not because they were finally figured out in advance, but because time passed and circumstances shifted, and the self that showed up in those moments was more capable than the self lying awake the night before believed it to be. The gap between what the mind anticipates and what the self can actually do is, in most cases, considerably larger than the midnight hours suggest. Not because the anticipated difficulties are imaginary, but because the self that will face them is more adaptive, more present, more genuinely capable of responding to what is actually there than any rehearsal can demonstrate. The darkness has a steadiness to it. It does not flicker. It holds the room without effort, without agenda, without any particular preference for how the night proceeds. There is something in this steadiness that is available to rest in, if the mind is willing to notice it alongside everything else it is producing. The imagined future and the actual present can coexist in the same awareness. The rehearsal can continue, if it will, and the body can rest in the genuine quiet of an actual night that is, in this moment, entirely safe. Both things are true. Both can be held. For now there is only this, the stillness, the particular quality of this particular night, the quiet and unhurried fact of being alive here, in this moment that will not recur and does not need to. Let that be enough. Let it be enough. The philosophers whose ideas have moved through this night's reflection did not arrive at perfect peace. Heidegger spent his life circling the question of what it means to exist, returning to it from different angles, never claiming to have resolved it. The Stoics practiced their distinctions daily, not because they had mastered them, but because the mastery was always approximate, always being renewed. The Buddhist teachers speak of a path rather than a destination, because the path is the point, the walking is what matters, and arriving somewhere final is not what the walking is for. The Taoists describe the Tao as something that cannot be named or held or fully understood, only moved with, only approximated in the quality of one's engagement with what is actually present. All of this is permission, if permission is needed, to leave this night unresolved, to allow the questions to remain open, the scenarios to remain unfinished, the mind to rest in its own activity without demanding that it produce closure before sleep is allowed to come. The open question is not a failure. It is a sign that something genuine is being held, something that matters enough to think about seriously, something that the self has not yet reduced to the manageable size of a settled answer. Stay with that. lightly. Let the night continue. Let the mind do what it does. And somewhere in the doing, perhaps, a quietness